In this video I want to discuss some of the points and comments that were made from a previous video where effectively I was talking about the garbage that some people talk about on YouTube. Now naturally when you contradict people's thoughts and beliefs, you get people coming back and arguing with you, and there was a few of those, and one of them, a really prominent YouTuber with over 100,000 subscribers, really tried to lay it into me. And when I responded with the technicalities behind my argument, this was about how I didn't consider ISO to be part of exposure, and I will explain that in a little while. He said I'd got it totally wrong and it was a silly comment. So I explained how digital ISO works, and he said wrong on so many accounts, and I challenged him to correct me, and 6 hours later he deleted the comments. Obviously, yeah, no expectation of anyone saying, oh, I'm sorry I got that wrong, but you know, this is what a lot of people are these days. And I'm not going to name people. Anyone that knows me knows who the hell it is. But suffice to say that if you don't own your mistakes, if you don't live and learn, then actually what's going to happen to you is you're going to either become a gobshite or you lose respect, or very likely both. So today I've decided to come out from a walk from the holiday cottage. This is where I stay during December through to just before Easter, when we start letting it again. But if you're interested in coming to this location, this village is called North Reps. It's 3 miles south of Cromer, and I'm going to be walking to Overstrand. So what I really want to tackle today is another couple of bits of BS that people spout a lot of the time, not just on YouTube, but yeah, photographers, novice photographers, I hasten to add here, because anybody that knows what they're talking about, anybody with experience, is going to know that the phrase straight out of camera is total crap. So let's consider what straight out of camera tends to mean to people. And I think it's one of two things. One of those things is and I'm trying to choose the words carefully here, but the ill-conceived superiority that somebody may have up here with this phrase straight out of camera. What they're trying to do is suggest because they haven't edited it, then it's somehow better than a photo that's been through a post-production phase. So there's an important part of digital photography that you need to understand. It's basically what happens when you start exposing your sensor to light. The sensor is full of light-sensitive transistors that collect that light. They react to the light, and what they do is they send a digital signal down the line to a processor, and that processor effectively starts storing the data somewhere in memory, on a card, whatever. Now obviously that's an incredibly simplified description of what happens. I don't want to go into anything else just yet. Once your sensor has collected this data and the processor has got hold of it, the processor has two choices in what it does with it. It can write it straight out to memory or the card, or it can run it through its internal settings to turn it into a JPEG. Well, basically one of those two things happen. So in a JPEG, what starts happening is that the processor acts upon what it's been told to do, what program it has. You have some control over this. You've got control over whether it's a really fine image or whether it's a really small image. You can often adjust the highlights and shadows, and in many cameras you've got some kind of creative modes. In my Olympus I've got art modes, never use them. Fuji cameras have got what they call film simulations, and basically it applies all of these settings and then it writes a JPEG out. And if all that happening in your camera isn't post-processing, I don't know what is. In fact, it's actually some of the worst type of post-processing you can apply, because it changes the file irrevocably. Whatever you tell it to do is baked in. And of course, don't forget, you're not telling it to do this in real time. You're not making these changes to it and these settings on the fly. You've told the camera that's how to work with the file. So that's what it's doing. It's post-processing with a certain degree of abdication of responsibility. I suppose there's an element that I've taken that too far, but I'm trying to make the point that straight out of camera it is BS. It's utter rubbish, because the camera's doing something. And again, whether you've told it to change those settings or not, straight out of the box it might be set to JPEG, and it's set to the way in which the factory tells it to modify and change highlights, to bring them down or to boost them, or to do the same with the shadows and the midtones. This is all happening in post-processing. It's just that you're not doing it. So you might turn around and say, well, I just shoot raw and I let my software kind of sort that out. Well, that's post-processing as well, because raw data isn't a photograph. It's a series of instructions that say, here's a bit of light at this point on the sensor, do something with it. Again, an oversimplification of it, but your software has to work with that bit of light and determine how to process it. And a raw processor such as Lightroom is going to deal with that data slightly differently from, say, a raw processor that could be Luminar, or my preferred option these days is PhotoLab from DxO, linked down below. And what you may find is that, if you have the luxury of having all of these things side by side, that the same raw file thrown into each different piece of software is going to produce a subtly different image at the end of it. Again, it's post-processing. However you get a digital file out of your camera, whether it's a JPEG or a RAW, it has to undergo some kind of post-processing in order to become the image that you see on a screen. Either that, or it's already undergone that processing in the camera. And I'm not saying you have to understand it for the sake of being a better photographer. That element is almost immaterial. I'm saying it because if you do understand it, you're more likely to stop pretending that straight out of the camera has any meaning, because it doesn't, and it might stop you being an arse. Of course, photographic processing starts up here, long before we get near a camera. My aim today so far has just been to walk to the sea, which has taken me, even including videoing, probably 25 minutes. So it's only a real short walk down to the beach from the cottage, if you want to walk, or it's even a shorter drive, of course. So I'm standing up on the cliffs here. The sea is really in, quite fierce. I suppose it is winter, isn't it? And I'm standing here and I'm thinking, what photos can I get? This is, if you want to coin a phrase, pre-processing. It's looking around and it's seeing the potential in what's around you. We got some very harsh light, and you'll have noticed, I'm sure, that throughout the video yeah, the light has been really quite awkward because it's been behind me all along. So yeah, I can't film so much like this because it exposes for the background. But now, what are we? We're check the time. It's 1:10 in the afternoon, beginning of January, early January, and at this time of year, of course, the sun is quite low in the sky. So what we have here, as you can kind of look out, perhaps, is the beach, and therefore the waves close in have got no light on them because they're shaded by this cliff. And I don't know that I want to walk down there to capture waves that have got no light. I could, but is it going to be worth it? Well, I suppose I might only just really establish that when I get down there. I think there's going to be shapes and yeah, smaller ripples, or not ripples, but where perhaps the tide is receding a little bit before the next wave comes in. I think there's going to be something in that, and perhaps shorter exposures, so I may need to use some ND filters to slow the shutter down a little bit more. Maybe I can put the teleconverter in and capture, yeah, you see some of these waves kind of cresting over here. I mean, they're quite interesting, and when they smack an immobile body, yeah, they kind of splash around and there's something interesting, but there's no light. But there is potentially, if I can swing you this way, there is potentially a quarter of a mile that way, so perhaps we'll do that. Now, I think also I learnt my lesson from the last video about trying to be either a little bit too high level with some of these topics, or perhaps not thinking about every possible scenario that might exist in your head or in your camera setup or whatever else that could be used as an argument against me. And actually, I do want to strike up discussion with people because, one, I'm not always right, for sure. I mean, none of us are. And actually, that's one of the biggest problems that we tend to face, particularly in more one-way situations like this, where you're listening to me and you've got a different opinion. And if you were to talk to me face to face and talk to me in the way in which some of you tried to in the last video's comments, then there's every chance that you'd get into an argument that you wouldn't want. So, hey, if you've got something to say, keep it civil. Keep it civil throughout social media, because if you wouldn't say these things to somebody's face in the way that you're keyboard worrying, then for God's sake, don't do it. Let's stick with the idea of straight out of camera for a moment, going back to the thought processes of possible discussions against this. Some people legitimately might be saying, what I mean when I say straight out of camera is, I mean, I've got the exposure right to start with. Well, that really is nothing to be too crowy about, because the camera tells you when it's in focus. It tells you when you've got good exposure. Anyone that has a live view is likely to have a live histogram, or probably not a DSLR, they'll clarify that. But a modern mirrorless camera, if you've got live view, you've got a live histogram. You've probably got peaking, exposure peaking zebras and such. There's all kinds of ways of getting exposure right in camera, and yeah, it's no big thing. It was for Ansel Adams, but these days it isn't. So I think there's an image. Just looking here, you can see you've got quite a rough sea, and for quite obvious reasons I don't want to be standing there for too long, so I'm going to concentrate more on the photo and not on the video for the minute, with your permission. Actually, even without your permission, because it's after the fact. You can't do anything about it, can you? there'll be something in those few that's worth looking at, I'm sure. So I put a 6-stop filter on an ND64, one of the magnetic ones from KNF Concept. This allowed me to just slow down that water movement to give it a more kind of milky dynamic feeling without going too far with it. I think it worked rather well. Let's talk about digital ISO. And in the last video I said this, though I don't consider ISO as part of exposure. I'll go into it another time. And people had a go at me over it. So let me explain. Firstly, this is my opinion. It's not facts. What I'm about to tell you is a lot closer to fact than opinion. But it's my opinion that ISO does not form part of exposure. And I'm not going to talk about the exposure triangle because that is a separate thing. The issue is that your shutter speed and your aperture are both creative choices in an exposure. If you want more depth of field, you use a wider aperture. If you want to freeze motion, you use a faster shutter speed. I don't really need to tell you this, I hope. And if I do, they're probably going to have to go off and find another video. And I probably haven't made that video because I don't tend to get too technical about these kind of things. I'm more into the how you do photography in terms of mindset and composition and that kind of stuff, rather than the technicals of it. But some people want to get stuck on the technicals, and of course it's not that I don't understand them, it's just that I'm not interested in them. Understanding these things helps you be better at certain things. Understanding how to change the wheel on a car makes you arguably a better driver. Understanding why that tyre needs to be a set pressure within a certain set of pressures helps you be a better driver, a safer driver, a more fuel efficient driver. Understanding what digital ISO does or how it works will help you. So let's go with it. Your exposure consists effectively of two things, doesn't it? It's the amount of light coming through the lens, i.e. the aperture, and the amount of time that the sensitive media is exposed to that light, the shutter speed. We consider ISO to be part and parcel of a triangle because it has an effect as well, but it's very much a secondary effect because it's in a camera, a digital camera, it's acting directly upon the electronics of the camera. Let me flesh this out a little bit more. If you understand, do you understand the difference between gain and volume? Gain is the amount of signal that goes into a system before it's processed or acted upon in some way. And volume is the amount of adjustment that happens to the signal after it's been processed before it's output to arguably a speaker. Again, simplifications, but that's effectively what it is. So when we're adjusting the ISO in the camera, what we're effectively doing is changing or adjusting the gain on the sensor. This has a number of different effects. Firstly, it makes the entire image brighter or darker, depending which way you're going, of course. When you're adjusting this, it also is effectively changing the amount of data that can be got off of the sensor at any point. So if as my camera has a sensor that has a native ISO of 200, if you start increasing that ISO so that it becomes, for want of a better phrase, more sensitive to light. It isn't more sensitive to light. It's as sensitive as it ever was. But what we're doing is we're adjusting the output from the sensor to be louder, if you like. One thing we know about making things too loud is that at some point you start getting degradation in in what you're getting out of it, in the signal. It's a signal to noise ratio. And again, I'm not going to get technical about this because partly I'm not, I understand it, but whether I can enunciate it out here with these crashing waves and get it right in one take is questionable. But we don't need that. What we need to understand is that as we play with the output amplification, the gain of the sensor, we start losing elements of that data. Now, we tend to think of it as noise, but actually it's an entire signal degradation, and we have limits as to where we're prepared to do this. But again, this is an entirely kind of thought process that I go through. What I don't want you to do is to say I'm right here in the exposure and ISO aren't intrinsically connected. Obviously they are, but what I'm saying is that to think of the ISO as part of a triangle where all of the elements, all of the sides of that triangle, the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO have equal standing is utterly wrong as far as I'm concerned. I'm not saying it's wrong as far as you're concerned, but when we're talking about increasing the ISO and getting degradation of our resulting image, regardless of whether you can pull that back in with software and such, that's immaterial to the point and discussion. When we start about changing the thing so that it is somehow worse than it ever could be by just changing the shutter speed and the aperture, then to consider that all elements of this triangle be equal is utterly wrong. I think there's an arguable point about the whole triangle thing as well. You can adjust the exposure without adjusting the ISO. So there's no equal pushing around. In effect, of course, what we tend to do, certainly in digital photography, is we adjust the ISO because we can't get the exposure settings that we want using the shutter speed and the aperture, which is in itself a good argument to say, actually, it isn't part of exposure so much. It's a brightness control. I don't think there's anything wrong in thinking about the exposure triangle containing ISO. I mean, it works, but I believe it's flawed. And I'm not saying that anyone's wrong for thinking otherwise. It's just another way of understanding how the system works. And if you understand better how something works, you can understand where the limits are, you can understand where you can push it, you can understand what's a good idea, what isn't a good idea. And what are we without knowledge? Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts. So if you're going to be rude, I may well be rude back and I'll block you. So yeah, be civil. If you've got a thought to put through, I'd love to hear it. I've made it up the top of the cliff. Sorry for any heavy breathing. I'm unfit. The view from up here is almost as it was down there, but there's some light, and what I've got catching some light is a groin marker down here, and I think in my head it kind of works. I'm not sure that it's going to work as a photo. Let me quickly just show you what I've got here. You can see there's a bench over there, and the groin marker I can pick up, and you can't see it, I know. You might be able to, very unlikely. But what I can do is I can pick up the groin marker through some of these dead grasses down here and just clip the edge of the bench in very soft focus going through it. And I think it's quite a nice image, but I've got to be quite careful I don't catch things being too in focus, because that bench just needs to be kind of notional and soft on the edge of it, on the back edge. And the nice thing that we've got now is that the sun's getting a little bit warmer as it's beginning to drop in the sky. What's the time? It's 2 o'clock, so we're a couple of hours off setting, but there's a definite different glow to it. You can see it picking up more on the waves down there. And I'm going handheld with it because things are moving, and if I was to put it on the tripod, I think it's a shot that doesn't need a tripod. And actually, that's another point that I ought to bring to your attention. A number of people have commented on the last video, largely because a lot of you are new, that I don't use a tripod for stability. Neither do I in most cases. I use a tripod because it slows me down. I use a tripod because it gives me repeatable compositions. I use a tripod because that tiny little bit of movement left and right can make or break an image, particularly in a situation like this where you're trying to get a view through something. And I can't hold that still like that. I'm no soldier, standing to attention and being able to hold my position. I want to be able to set it up on something that isn't going to move and get a shot when the light's right, or get different exposures, do some exposure bracketing, all kinds of things. Please don't get it into your heads that a tripod is only there for stability. Oh, I've got 5 stops of stabilization, or whatever it happens to be. It's probably more. I don't need a tripod. You might think that for stabilization, but believe me, tripods are so much more useful than just stopping your camera moving whilst you're taking a shot. My Osmo Pocket was low on juice, so I had to charge it. Thankfully, I had this really slimline power bank from Asperix. It's a 10,000 milliamp hour battery, and it's really slim and quite light, so it's easy to carry. Thanks very much for sending it through. I'll talk about it more in another video. On my way back now, coming up the track, there's railway bridge here, an old railway bridge. The line was closed 60-something years ago. This area has been kind of sheltered most of the day, and there's still some frost, and it's really interesting. And it's another reason for using the tripod, because the tripod is allowing me for absolutely precise positioning. It's not moving. Now, you might say, well, that's stabilization. No. What most people talk about with stabilization is to stop camera shake. I'm talking about absolutely precision position of a subject. Now, of course, I already mentioned that before, but the point here is illustrated in that the camera is straight down on it, and nothing's moving. Now, of course, it might be changing. The little bit of frost that I'm photographing might be defrosting. That's just allowing me to take more compositions or more photos of the same thing when it looks a little bit different from the same perspective. Now, you might argue, well, wouldn't you be better working with different perspectives? Yeah, perhaps. But if I've got one that I like, I can roll off a couple and then I can move the tripod rather than waving around and and hoping. Sorry, I've got a cough coming. And the point is very much that we've got to be very careful of what creeps in around the edges, because if something creeps in that grabs the eye, bang, that's your composition gone. You may have to crop it out later, which I suppose then runs back to a previous argument about, well, I like to crop, and megapixels allow me to crop. Well, so do 20 megapixels. My argument back in the last video is not specifically that more megapixels aren't useful, it's more that most people don't need them. And obviously the more megapixels you got, the bigger the file, the faster, the more powerful the computer you need, and all of that kind of thing. I can crop in quite happily on a 20 megapixel image to quite some way. And the point is that it depends on the outcome. How are you going to use that image? Because if it's only going to be displayed on a small 1080p screen, which is, as we've already said 2.1 megapixels or just under, then having 20 just means that you're cropping it in screen anyway to get it on there. So yeah, please don't think that I'm wrong in saying more megapixels are bad. What I'm saying is most of the time people don't need them, and the benefit of them is often lost if you're only ever displaying electronically. The light has begun to fade. Actually, it's faded really fast now, but I'm by the old railway bridge, and what was happening, you just about see it happening still there, is the sun was just catching the bricks on the other side. I knew that if I started recording too soon that I was just going to miss the light. Literally it's 5 minutes or so from walking up here and finding that, and it's what I've got is a lovely study of the light hitting the brickwork, and I've had to find a really specific shot for this because you've got all of this lilac or whatever it is in the way, making it messy. Yeah, you've got to kind of get through it so you're not capturing that. And I've got a really, what I think is really nice images. It's just really, it's a study of light and texture, the way it's hidden that. And you can see now on the bridge, it's just totally gone. But that arch was beautifully illuminated for a while in part. And I don't know whether this is going to end up being a black and white image. There's not a lot of colour in it because it's just golden sun and the grey greeny of the bricks. But again, tripod, absolutely vital thing to have here. I had to position it exactly and keep the position there because I didn't have a great deal of light. Yes, I would have got camera shaking it even with stabilization because I'm having to zoom in a little bit. So, you know, what is it, twice? I can't remember what the equation is because I don't have to remember it in terms of focal length and shutter speed and such. But yeah, the fact is that if I didn't use a tripod, I would have got a blurry image because I couldn't keep it still. But that's a secondary point to actually being able to finesse that image in the first place, is to find that way through and make sure that it does not move.
It would have been a real shame to have made this black and white, so I didn't.
Back out in the open again. Sun's really beginning to set now. Get some lovely long shadows. Not that the shadows are helping me particularly at the moment. As I came through the railway bridge earlier, I spied some ropes on trees with wood through them that the kids have put there for swings. I spent some time getting some compositions of that, so I'll put that up in a moment. And the reason I didn't film it is because the camera's been away charging. I've worn it out. But here we are, we're on the other side of the village now. I suppose I've walked 2.5 miles, maybe, at most. Village is just over there. I've crossed the main road. I'm on what's known as the Paston Way, which is a long distance footpath in Norfolk. And here you probably see the spire of the village church. And I'm getting a nice green here. I mean, you can see how green that is. It's beautiful. And a few of these lines in the grasses, the crop or whatever here, kind of leading up to the church tower. I'm heading down here and I'm going to do a loop back through the woods. Well, I've run out of things to rant about and I'm nearly back at the coziness of the cottage, so I'm going to leave you hoping that you've enjoyed what I've been talking about and that you've enjoyed the pictures. If you have, please leave a like, and you might want to watch some of the other things as well, so they're appearing just here. We'll see you on the next one.